the real era of propaganda where black people disappear entirely from ancient history isn't a 19th century thing, it's a 20th century thing. But what 20th century scholars did was to fake the funk and tell everybody, no, that wasn't our generation. That was the 18th century, that was the 19th century. No, it wasn't. It was the 20th century. So you could find the book in the 19th century that says the ancient Egyptians were sort of black people. You can't find a 20th century book that says that. You could find a 19th century book that says that the Moorish culture in Spain was sort of something to do with Africa. You can't find a 20th century book that says that. Yeah? So the real suppression of black history was a 20th century suppression. It wasn't a 19th century suppression, despite the claim that it was.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Down with the King. Today I am joined by a scholar whose work I would say has had a massive impact on me, and I wouldn't say it was just his work. I think it's his work ethic and also his history of trailblazing in an arena which was previously untapped. Black history is something that I think has a global impact and a different impact in different regions. But for us in the UK, it's something for a long time that we were starved of, and we had to look toward America in order to get our information, in order to get our scholarly heroes, and in order to understand our past. That was until this man came along, and his 2006 book, When We Rule, quickly became his seminal work and became a staple in many British households and globally, and really brought an understanding of what Black history was and what our historical Black populations were truly capable of. Since then, he has a book out at the moment called Ancient African Origins, which is available from Flame Tree Publishing. This man is easily one of the foremost scholars of Black history globally, and it's a real privilege and an honor for me to have him on the channel. I've wanted to have him on the channel for some time now, so getting this opportunity is very exciting for me. So I'd like to take this time to introduce to you someone who you're probably familiar with, Mr. Robin Walker.
Good morning to you, sir.
Hello, sir, and welcome to Down with the King.
Thanks for having me on your show.
It's a privilege. It's a privilege. It's actually amazing to have you on the show. This is something that we've been trying to do for a little while now. And I obviously became familiar with Black Secrets, which is the organization that you work with in terms of Black history, quite some time now. And we've done a few bits and bobs, but strangely enough, we hadn't done a one-to-one interview yet. So kind of ticking that box and also having this opportunity to have this conversation with you definitely is a really big deal for me. So thank you. I'd like to dive in and talk to you. I think there's a lot of different things we could talk about today, but I'd like to talk to you about the latest work that you're releasing, which is this Ancient African Origins. Sounds amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about what this work is and what the inspiration was behind essentially writing this new piece?
I received a commission last year. Somebody wrote to me out of the blue to say that they want a book written for them on African origins, and would I be interested? So we agreed the contract, and I set to work on the book. I had a deadline of April this year to finish. And the idea was not African history, although the book is a history. It was African origins, tracing things back to their point of origin. And so how I wrote the book is I begin with the story of modern Africa, and then the book goes backwards. So modern Africa was mostly born between the Berlin Conference of the 1880s and the colonial period and post-colonial period. And that's why we have modern countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. Those are all modern colonial era creations. And so going back now in tracing origins, if we take, sake of argument, Nigeria, we would have to look at, well, what were the kingdoms that were there before there was such a place called Nigeria? So if we're talking about the northern part of Nigeria, that would have been the Sokoto Caliphate. What's the Sokoto Caliphate? I need to tell that history. Before that, it was the Hausa Confederation. Who are the Hausas? What were they dealing with? I have to tell that history. In a different part of Nigeria, there would have been the Oyo Empire, Yoruba land. So I need to tell what was the Oyo civilization. Before that, it would have been the kingdom of Ife. What's its history? Before that, it would have been the kingdom of Erido. What's its history? And so tracing the stories back, when it comes to the Nigerian thing, you're aware of the Dafuna canoe?
Yes.
6,000 to 6,500 BC, the third oldest boat in the world is in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Iron smelting, the first place on the planet Earth to do iron smelting is in Nigeria, a site called Leja, which is in the Nsukka region of eastern Nigeria. They're the first people on the planet. And since people claim that there's a link between whoever started iron and whoever created civilization, that raises some powerful questions. And then before...
I just jump really quickly and ask, do we have a date for that iron smelting in Nigeria?
Yes, 2,600 or thereabouts BC.
Amazing.
So if we're using the short chronology, as it's called, it's 2,600 BC. And there's an article called Science, Not Black Magic, Iron and Glass Production in Africa, where they drop that knowledge. Yeah. Okay, so what else do we have? And then before you had these civilizations, the people of northern Nigeria would have been part of a linguistic group that the scholars call Afro-Asiatic. Don't be put off by the second half of the word Asiatic. It's got nothing to do with Asia. It's just linguists talking nonsense, unfortunately. Afro-Asiatic has its origins in East Africa. And a second group of people in the southern parts of Nigeria, they would go back to a population called Niger-Congo. And then we can trace these populations, Niger-Congo, we can trace that back 16,000 years. We can do the same thing with Afro-Asiatic. So consequently, tracing origins now, which country are you from, sir? Don't mind me asking.
I am Nigerian.
Which ethnic group?
So my dad is from Ondo State. So there's kind of a distant well, I wouldn't say distant. There's a relation to the Edo people there.
Mm-hmm. Edo is going to be Benin.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So go on.
No, carry on. And your mum is, you're about to say?
My mum's from Ijesha, also known as Ilesha.
Mm-hmm.
Which is yeah. So yeah, that's it. So you're both Yoruba, but Ondo State is very much accepted to be a dialect of Yoruba in acknowledgement that they know they're not originally a Yoruba-speaking people.
The reason I'm bringing that up is because of this research into tracing origins, connecting you and your ancestry to the broader scope of Niger-Congo links you to a prehistory going back 16,000 years. And then we can then trace the steps in that prehistory. Shout out to the late Professor Christopher Ehret, whose book I rinsed out to map this prehistory. I rinsed that book out because what he does is he using linguistics and archaeology, gives people a prehistory. And in that prehistory, you start to see all the technological developments. So what many Yorubas think of as, we invented the vertical loom. No, you didn't. Your ancestors, who were Niger Congo, already had that loom. Do you see? And therefore, by the time you guys became Yoruba speakers, that loom was already a part of the technology. And the textiles that came out of those looms was already a part of the technology. And that is how Professor Ehret's work has changed the game. It's added whole chapters. So that's what the book is about. It's about African origins, the modern situation, the civilizations that came before, and the prehistory. And then I go all the way back to the beginnings of humanity. I do a lot of work in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government brands their country Land of Origins, because that's obviously where human fossils, a large number of them have been found. So that's the scope of the book. So it's like that across African history. So it's probably the most detailed and comprehensive work I've ever written.
It sounds amazing. I think I'll be getting it, no doubt. And when you first said what the aim of the book was, it sounded like it's a book that's more grounded in anthropology than just general history. Would you say that's a fair assessment? No. It's history. It's history. When people say anthropology, it tends to give a kind of primitivizing vibe and energy to the history. And as they say in Jamaica, me no ina that, yeah? Everything I write when it comes to our history has to be grand, has to be dignified. I have a theory that when Black people put pen to paper to write history, your history is supposed to do two things. One, it's supposed to build pride in African heritage. And two, it's supposed to win the respect of non-African people. So if Nigel Farage picks up the book, he should be so angry about the grandeur of African culture presented. Does that make sense? Whereas anthropology, as my tutor, the very great Dr. Femi Biko used to teach, comes from the word anthropoid, which means apes. Yeah? Oh, and so it was Greek anthropos, which means...
Anthropos means man. That's what they want you to... Anthropoid is... So basically, it's sociology for them and anthropology for you.
Ah,
does that make sense?
That Euro trickery going on there again.
Yeah, no, there are people in the comments that are going to say, no, anthropos means man. Yeah, whatever. That's why anthropology for us, sociology for them. And that's why I try not to get involved in the kind of anthropological thing, because it primitivizes. Fair
enough. That's a really interesting take, because I always say that I'm probably more interested in anthropology. Well, at least I take an anthropological approach in a lot of what I do.
I think you mean physical anthropology.
Yeah, I mean, there's the four strands, but I think I kind of touched them all. But I like the aspect of focusing on. So even when you're talking about like historically, prior to the establishment maybe of a modern Yoruba tongue, you had this, this overriding linguistic family or phylum called the Niger Congo, where they all descend to.
Yeah.
That sounds to me like linguistic anthropology, because you're looking at the
It is, but don't be thinking that the cultures being described are primitive. You've got to remember they're using the loom. They've had the loom for 4,000 years. Do you see?
Yeah.
Consequently, they're wearing textiles.
It sounds primitive to me. It sounds amazing. You know.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah. So let me jump on something that you said, because there's loads of things that I've written down here that I want to dive into, but I do want to jump on one thing that you said in regards to when you construct a book, it should instill pride, but also it should raise the temperature of people who are maybe anti-black. They're going to pick it up and they're going to be, essentially affronted by the contents that are in such a book. Would you say, because this is a larger question, would you say that that's a symptom or symptomatic of something that's a problem in our society? In that, why is Black history seen as an attack, or why is it interpreted when we simply put pen to paper, like you said, and document our actual history, the things we've contributed? Why is it that is seen as a direct attack on Western civilization, or on people who quote unquote classify themselves as being white people? Why is our history, why should it, it wouldn't offend me if someone's like, showing me like Asian history or something like that, and I wouldn't instantly, my instant reaction wouldn't be, oh, how dare you, why? What is this phenomenon? I'd love for you to kind of expand on that a bit.
Because we Black people, unfortunately, do not enjoy the same status that everybody else enjoys. So if a school teacher was known to be an expert on Chinese history, that school teacher would be celebrated. Yeah, bring that information into the classroom. But once it becomes Black history, in many schools, you're better off keeping your mouth shut, because you don't want the negative attention that comes with what you know about Black history. Our status isn't the same. So when people talk about liberalizing the teaching of history, what they mean is, instead of making it just European history, include the people from Asia, include the Arabs, include the Indians, include the Chinese. And as far as they're concerned, that has liberalized the history so that it becomes anti-racist. And so you will get intellectuals that will teach world history, including the people from India, the people from Arabia, the Persians, the Chinese. See, I'm anti-racist. And I asked the obvious question, where's Africa in all of this? And a lot of people don't see a problem because they believe that Africa has no part in any of this. There was an article that me and one of the Black Secret colleagues, George, we were talking about this only yesterday. And the article was, and you can look this up, it was called, Why is it that all these books on Africa all have the same front cover? And the front cover is the acacia tree. And you can Google this. There's an article where people analyze books on Africa. And these books, some of them could be history, some of them could be novels, some of them could be books on political economy, and they all have the same acacia tree on the front cover. And the significance of that is this. History is human achievement in humanizing the world. It has to be human intervention. So history cannot be an acacia tree. It has to be, what monuments did those people build? What fine art did those people create? What manuscripts did they write? What gold did they produce? What technologies did they create? And by making the image of Africa the acacia tree, you've made that natural history. You haven't made that history. And this idea that Black people do not have any heritage comparable with the people of Arabia, the people of Persia, the people of India, the people of China, unfortunately, that is the mainstream perspective. And so when you assert then that Africa has a history and a heritage, and we're going to talk about it, you are at the same time humanizing Black people. And we live in a world where the default position is to dehumanize Black people. And this is why when people deal with Black history, there is pushback, because the default position was to dehumanize, not humanize. So the default position is most of the world's intellectuals do not consider Black people to be the equal of the people of Arabia, Persia, India, or China.
That is fascinating, to say the least. You're someone who does a lot of work, and I particularly really respect the work that you do in the lesser spoken about areas of African civilization. As you know, a lot of my work is heavily weighted in the Nile Valley, and I'm not ashamed to say that, but I also do work on the Moors, Timbuktu, getting some of the kind of like headline civilizations, so to speak. You do work on really deep work on lots of Africa, and a lot of time you're bringing to the fore civilizations, achievements that people wouldn't have heard of before. So I just love the fact that that's what you dedicated your life to. It makes life easy for people like me who can just pick up your book and then get into a brand new civilization that I've never heard of before and just kind of learn something new. This is where I'm going to ask you a question, because somewhere along the line, a deconstruction has happened, and a separation has happened, which is the modern state of Africa. Actually reminds me of a book by a woman called Meredith something I've got out there called The State of Africa. And it talks about the modern situation where Africa, all of Africa, so to speak, or they might say sub-Saharan, which is a term that I hate, but whatever, it's being re-employed these days, is in a certain state. And that state is, like you said, there's a gap between what Africa was and the state that it's currently in. My question to you is, what has created that gap? Obviously, obvious answer is kind of like, yeah, Berlin Conference, colonization. But where, if there was these achievements, these monuments, these buildings, this knowledge, take us through a little bit of what the process, if there was one, of deconstruction looked like for the average African civilization. Why are they, in a state now where essentially we're trailing behind a lot of the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's a complicated process. And shout out to African-American professor Chancellor James Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization. And that was a topic area that he focused on. And I see myself as a disciple of Professor Chancellor Williams. All right, very, very simply, all civilizations have a relationship of core and periphery. And in the core of every civilization, these will be the cities. That will be a core. And within the cities, the core within the city will be your skilled people. Your architects, your masons, your astronomers, your writers, your scribes, that type of thing. And then you would have your peripheries, which would be your villages. And your villages would be, what would be happening would be agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. Every civilization is like that. Even if you were in Britain and you're traveling around Britain, do you remember the days when there used to be things called internet centers, where you would go to sit in an internet room? If you try to do that in a British village,
So you mean like internet cafes?
yeah, you know that if you tried to do that in a British village, there wouldn't be any internet cafes. Those are city things.
Yeah.
When it comes to the big libraries, those are in cities, they're not in villages. So some parts of Africa have faced invasion, attack, and slavery. If we're talking about North Africa, the Romans conquered North Africa between 146 BC and 30 BC, and stayed in control for the next 700 years, making themselves the ruling class. What happened to the indigenous Africans? They became reduced to the status of slaves. And then there was the Arab conquest of North Africa, 639 AD to 708 AD. What happened when they conquered? The indigenous Africans became reduced to the status of slaves. And if people weren't slaves, they became outcasts. And so they ended up living in the most inhospitable places, getting away from Roman rule or getting away from Arab rule. And what that means is you end up moving away from where the old cities used to be, where the old culture used to be. Now, in dealing with transatlantic enslavement, the beginnings of that is 1441. Originally, it wasn't transatlantic, it was snatching people and bringing them to Portugal, snatching people and sending them to Madeira and the islands off the coast of Africa. By the time we get to the year 1500, it's snatching people and bringing them to the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. During this process, if you are invaded by conquerors, if your villages are destroyed, that's your agriculture destroyed, your forestry destroyed, your fishing destroyed, your hunting destroyed. The cities starve. Do we understand that? Yeah?
Yeah.
Because if those people are killed, the cities starve. And if the people in the cities are killed or captured or enslaved, the people that used to be the scribes end up on slave ships. The people that used to be the doing eye cataract surgery, as they were doing in the city of Jenne in Mali, they end up on a slave ship. That technology disappears. If the people that did textiles end up on a slave ship, that technology disappears. And sometimes you can replace it by creating new trade routes. But if slavery is going on for a long enough period of time, your trade routes get interrupted too. And then once trade routes are interrupted, the wealth that would have fed the cities disappears, and then the people in those cities starve. And so this is how you end up with what was high culture degenerating. And then when you have slave raids going on, people will try to find the most inhospitable places. Let me give you an example. You've heard of the Dogon of Mali and their high intellectual culture that people have talked about in terms of their astronomy, in terms of their ideas of abstract physics and so on. They live in the Bandiagara cliffs. Have you ever asked yourself the question, what on earth are they doing in the Bandiagara cliffs?
Yeah.
Right. Now that we understand the model, you understand that they're there for their own safety, dodging slave raiders and so forth. And so that's how you end up. Now, living on the Bandiagara cliffs, no culture can survive with its high technology in place in that type of situation. So that's the beginnings of it. So that's what slavery did. What colonization did was to make the ancient civilizations disappear. So you're from Nigeria. There is no empire of Benin anymore in Nigeria. We can point to where the palace was. We can point to where the ancient city of Great Benin was. but there's no Empire of Benin anymore. There's no Sokoto Caliphate anymore. There's no Oyo Empire anymore. All of this is now has been flattened into this new construction called Nigeria. Does that make sense? All right, now let me show you how your history can be mashed up without trace. You've all heard of Kanem Bornu, right? Kanem Bornu, a bit of it is in Nigeria. The Bornu part of it is in Nigeria. The Kanem part of it, some of it was in Libya, some of it was in Niger, some of it was in Chad, and some of the Bornu part of it was in Cameroon. Now, can you see what used to be an ancient civilization has now been split between 5 countries? And having been split between 5 countries, all that heritage has disappeared. Sure, Bornu texts have appeared in Nigerian libraries. I know because I've seen some of them. But the heritage has disappeared. It's almost like colonialism wiped that from the face of the map. Once you're split between 5 countries, you're finished. What have you got? Do you see? And that's what happened during the colonial period. And so when Black historians started putting pen to paper, they were asserting that we had these things. And as the more and more evidence came into being, they were able to document more and more of these things. But in doing so, this was an anti-colonial act because the colonizers didn't want you to say you had anything. And let me show you how that works. The Empire of Benin, the Royal Palace, according to Captain Richard Burton, and I've got his text, contained 15,000 people. Did you hear what I just said? 15,000 people.
Yeah.
As you know, the British conquered Benin in 1897 and burned the palace to the ground. Do you know that during the colonial period, they were not allowed to rebuild that palace? Why not? Because it would have been a symbol of Black pride. So they weren't allowed to do that. That is how you end up further and further behind. Do you see?
Yeah. That was a excellent answer. Thank you for going into that much detail. Let me just kind of go back a few steps because you mentioned loads of stuff that I could have talked about there. I do want to talk about that. Going back to your mention of the way the Kanem Bornu Empire spread essentially from what we call the Guinea region of Africa, the kind of Nigeria, across the Sahel, right up into Libya. And the reason I bring that up is because from the research that I've done, empires of that shape, kind of like stretching across the Sahel, tended to be a little bit of a, seemed to be a bit of a pattern in Africa. And that really breaks the, I guess, the ideology that people have about Africa, especially in modern times now, where I feel like there's this effort to create this this sub-Saharan, we mentioned earlier, divide, or this north-south divide, or this east-west divide, and to really isolate African groups into their modern colonial borders and act like those silos go back, you know, thousands of years into history. You've just mentioned a single empire, which throws that out of the, you know, completely throws that out of the water. This is a single empire, and it spans essentially from one coast of Africa to another, which is...
It did swallow up all of Libya. It got as far as the Fezzan region of Libya. So it didn't swallow up all of it. But you're right, it did come pretty close to swallowing up all of it. And that's not the only one. If you look at the book, A Tropical Dependency by Lady Lugard, Flora Shaw, the inside cover has maps of medieval Mali, the Songhai Empire, and Kanem Bornu. And the northern extent of Mali and the northern extent of Songhai was very, very far north, very far north. including, in the case of Songhai, a Libyan city. There was a city in Libya that was swallowed up by the Songhai Empire as well. So here's the thing. This idea of the Sahara was too big a boundary for Negroes to cross is simply modern historical fiction. As my tutor, again, the very great Dr. Femi Biko teaches, this whole thing about North Africa and Africa south of the Sahara, he says you do not qualify the majority. So calling Africans south of the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africans, you're qualifying the majority. You don't qualify the majority. You should be qualifying the minority.
Yes.
So he uses the term Greater Africa for what most people call sub-Saharan, and he uses the term Africa Minor for North Africa.
I like that. I actually use the term coastal Africans. And then I just call everyone else Africans. I refuse to engage in any talk of sub-Sahara or any. I either say Africans or continental Africans. Coastal Africans. Yeah. And what's really interesting is, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but there is a modern attempt, and it's being led by population geneticists, to isolate North Africa from the rest of Africa. And these are within populations that are within the boundaries of many of the civilizations that we're talking about. So these would have been populations that at a certain day would have been part of Songhai or Mali or Garamantes, of different African populations, but they're doing their level best to say, no, these are isolated North African populations. They've got nothing to do with quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa. Have you picked up on this kind of recent attempt to separate ancient North Africa from the rest of Africa, and what's your thoughts on it?
I'm not an expert in genetics, but I do believe the next generation of scholars need to master it so that we can get to the bottom of it in pretty much the same way that Professor Sheikh Anta Diop did it with ancient Egypt. He was able to see through their lies, and we need to do the same thing with genetics. Now, this notion of sub-Saharan Africa being disconnected from North Africa and so on. Well, my thing is, I think many people have seen the reconstruction of Jebel Irhoud man from Morocco 300,000 years ago. Jebel Irhoud looks just like 50 Cent. You've seen that reconstruction already, right?
You know what? I'm not sure if I have. As you said it, I was like, that doesn't ring a bell. But I'll put it up on the screen for this as a part of what you're doing.
Okay. Jebel Irhoud. In other words, this is mainstream things. Even the Daily Mail dropped the knowledge on Jebel Irhoud, right? All right. Why am I saying this? This 300,000-year-old Moroccan, or whatever date they're coming with, is clearly, unmistakably sub-Saharan, looking just like 50 Cent. Then you have Jebel Kasfeh 9, I think the skull is. If it's not 9, it might be 6, where they've reconstructed the face. And that got published in the Daily Mail as well. I like to use the Daily Mail as a source because I like to use right-wing sources.
Yeah.
Now, the significance of Jebel Kasfeh is this is in modern-day Israel. And so if you have clearly Negro populations in Israel and clearly Negro populations in Morocco, it's fairly obvious that this idea that the Sahara was this barrier that kept Black people out is nonsense. Now, once you know this, and once you know that the human race is of African origin, there was a time when Black people were everywhere. Everybody on the planet Earth at one time was African in appearance. And that will include black people outside Africa too. You're already familiar with the research that found the data on Cheddar Man in Britain.
Yeah.
They found similarly dark-skinned populations in Ireland, dark-skinned populations in Sweden. I've seen the reconstruction of the first European, Pestera su Oasi in Romania, the first reconstructions in Russia and so on. And so what it was black people were everywhere. So if we believe what the geneticists are telling us, black people were everywhere, including outside Africa, but not North Africa. Yeah, whatever, pull the other one.
Well, I think this is the game that they play, or at least I think, because Africana, I'm going to use the word Africana scholars or black scholars have done such a good job. And to be honest with you, I guess in my mind, when you're operating from a position where you're not lying, you're just simply presenting the truth. What happens is all of the science will kind of just fall in and agree with what you're saying anyway. So I think what's happened is, since scholars like yourself and Africana scholars have done such a good job of proving the fact that these ancient populations were black, they've now moved the goalposts where they say, okay, well, they were black physically, they look like you, but they're related to us. So that's where the goalpost has moved to. So that's the argument they reserve for us. It's like, well, they weren't related to anyway, regardless of what you say. These people might have been black and they might have been negro, but they weren't sub-Saharan. In other words, they weren't related to you. But then when they present that same argument to the general public, they say, well, this person is related to, like you've mentioned, that you have this black Palestinian, is related to this person, so therefore he's Eurasian. But they'll leave out the part that he's physiognomically a black person. So the general public just think, oh, well, he's just an Arab man. So, and these are the games they play. I noticed they play different games depending on which audience they're presenting to, and just prey on people's ignorance of the general subject of physical anthropology in history. It's just something that, sorry, go on.
No, well said, sir, well said. And the game playing will continue until something happens, and that something is when black people are genuinely seen by academia as the equals of everybody else. That's when the game playing will stop. But between now and then, the game playing will continue. And so you will get silly things like the people of modern Arab Egypt protesting the representation of Cleopatra. I mean, nonsense. And it's a situation where, come on, get real. And you will get this type of nonsense that will keep on happening. And it will, as I said, we're not going to end this until the default position is black people are humanized, not dehumanized.
Well, on that note then, let me ask you a more loaded but practical question, because I'd be interested to hear your feedback on this. Do you have any optimism there to be a unified history curriculum in the UK?
Yes, I do.
What I mean when I say a unified history curriculum.
Yeah, what will happen is, of course, you will get the Faragistas and their allies trying to oppose it, but they can't really oppose it because, facts are facts. So there's this idea going around in Britain that we are the indigenous people. And how that happened is by not telling people the truth, that the people of England are really of Germanic descent and entered the British Isles, the time period 400, 500 AD. And consequently, the people of England the people that call themselves English are actually a branch of Germanic culture that came to these islands at a particular point in time. And before that, they weren't here. Does that make sense? And we can big up the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. We can big them up, their cultural importance, their language is the basis of modern British Isles. But the bottom line is, when it comes to time period, those people do not go back before 400 AD in Britain. And anyone who suggests anything else is a liar and a fraud. And so I do believe that you can get scholars around the table to agree to some of this. And I do think that some of the changes that some of the physical anthropologists, because there are physical anthropologists that do admit that before certain genes appeared, 10,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, everybody was of African appearance. And consequently, that's why Cheddar Man has the appearance that he has. I posted something that was in the Daily Mail where they speculated on who was here during the Stonehenge period. I don't know. Did you see that article?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. No. The Daily Mail dropped that knowledge. So I do believe in the future we could have a unified curriculum, but of course we're going to have to fight for it.
Amazing. You are way more optimistic than me. I think I come from a position of massive distrust because I think I'm a qualified teacher, so I spent some time. I spent a good few years of my life with teachers, and I always picked up that one of their favorite subjects that they like to teach, history teaching I'm talking about now, one of the favorite subjects that they enjoyed teaching was Black history. They love Black History Month. So this idea that, they love Black History Month, but that's not because they went out and picked up When We Ruled and started teaching their class about Timbuktu and Jenne and, African achievements and, great cities and no, that's because they went out and they taught their class about slavery. Well, not just about slavery. They taught their class the truth about slavery. It wasn't English people doing all the bad things. We ended slavery. It was those damn Africans. They kept giving each other away. They are the ones that are perpetuating. They love teaching it. They absolutely love it. And part of me in my mind thinks, first of all, I know that's not what's on your curriculum. You're doing a lot of embellishing there. So I don't know if you just got to YouTube or something like that, but you're doing a lot of embellishing there. Clearly, that's not what you were given on the curriculum. But in addition to that, my thoughts are, could you ever be trusted to teach this correctly? Or will you always default to your English biases?
Let me answer that.
In my mind. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. You go.
Let me answer that. The reason school teachers do that is because their entire education makes Europe the center. And if they want to be anti-racist, you include the Arabs, the Persians, the Indians, and the Chinese. And once you've done that, you've fulfilled your anti-racist agenda. Do you see? And that is where those school teachers are at. So when it comes to where Black people fit into world history, they really do think that we are a non-factor. And why they think that we are a non-factor is everything they've ever studied at university teaches that we are a non-factor. Every subject, it could be literature. If you study literature, you'll start with the Greeks, you'll start with the Romans, then there's the European Dark Ages, then you've got the post-medieval literature, the Renaissance period, that's where Shakespeare comes in. The Baroque and classical periods, that's where Jane Austen comes in. That's the version of history that they teach. And if they want to then make it non-racist, include Persian poetry in the thing, include Urdu poetry in the thing, include Sun Tzu in the thing. And in that way, see, we diversified. Unfortunately, that is how Europeans think, because that's what they've been told. They haven't been told anything else. So just basic things, simple things, simple things. Coffee is from Ethiopia. People will give me pushback. No, it isn't. It's called coffee Arabica.
Yeah.
Dude, I've been to the region in Ethiopia where they started coffee.
Yeah. But even Arabica coffee is grown in Ethiopia. It's just rebranded Arabica because people don't want coffee from Africa.
And the fact that Arabica is part of the problem. Why was it branded Arabica? Why wasn't it branded Ethiopica?
Yeah.
Do you see? And so you can see now, Professor Chancellor Williams says, when racism becomes ridiculous, it also becomes humorous. Yeah? Something as trivial as where did coffee start is sufficient to create an argument. Yeah.
That's you know what's so interesting about the answer that you just gave me there? You kind of listed off these things that the racism, I guess, that's in every layer of our educational and our academic kind of process. You know, we go through schooling, and at every single point or juncture that you mentioned relates back to, if you understand real history, which obviously you do, relates back to Africa or Black people directly, not even indirectly. It's like, how are you teaching literature, first of all, and you don't know that the letters in your alphabet originate in Africa? A lot of people don't know that. How do you not know that your Latin alphabet links directly back to the Greek, which links directly back to the Phoenician, which links directly back to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph? So you wouldn't even have an alphabet if it wasn't for Africans. How do you know of the Dark Ages but not know that that was a 1,000-year period of Moorish rule? How do you know about, classical period, but you don't understand that it was the Moors that brought the Renaissance to Europe? How do you know about scholars and mathematicians and all of these? And there's been what can only be described as a deliberate stripping of Black presence from every element. Because like you just said there, they're okay with filling the quota with China. They're okay with filling the diversity quota, let's call it. They're okay with filling that with, Baghdad. They love Baghdad, a bit of Baghdad. They're okay. But there is this really, I would have to call it a violent aversion to ever linking anything back to Black people. And this is where we kind of get more into the realm of conspiracy, because I'm like, it's almost like it's more difficult to uphold this lie that you're presenting the world with than to
Let me answer that. But one of the reasons they can uphold the lie is we Black people haven't stepped correctly on our history either. Yeah, let me explain. In the same way that Professor Youssef Ben-Yochanan created the Black history tours of ancient Egypt, there's enough heritage in your end, Nigeria, to create a Black history tour of Nigeria that would be just as impactful. You all have still got the palaces still standing. You all have still got the manuscripts. You all still got the fine art. Yeah? But what you all didn't do was represent. Do you see? And so consequently, the world has been allowed to think of Africa as safari, but not heritage, because people didn't push the heritage front and center. Or it becomes a hot place to go on the beach. No, you need to push the heritage front and center, and it could be done. And the big discovery for me, and this is what prompted me to put pen to paper, my beginnings as the Black history man was to read Professor Chancellor James Williams's The Destruction of Black Civilization. And his theory is, yep, Black people had history, but the evidence has all been destroyed. My discovery is the evidence wasn't all destroyed. Buildings are still standing. So if we take a Nigerian example, the Grand Palace of Kano, 1482, is still standing. That should have been a tourist attraction long time. You see, not like the one in Benin where the British flattened it and didn't allow it to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
And now that we know enough about the architecture of Benin Palace should be fully rebuilt and fully restored at its 15,000 people scale. And then that becomes another tourist attraction. But even in the absence of rebuilding the Benin Palace, there is tons of heritage in Nigeria that could be sold to the general public, especially to the Black general public, that puts the best foot forward. Mm-hmm. And there are so many examples across Africa where you can do that. And that's the kind of way that I think we can change the narrative.
That sounds very exciting to me. The idea even of rebuilding some of these lost monuments that we have written descriptions of.
Yeah, because let me just jump in. You do realize that the monuments in Britain are all rebuilt. You do realize London burned down during the Great Fire of London. What is in central London today? Rebuilt.
Yeah.
You do realize that the grandest monument in France, the Notre Dame Cathedral, right now is a rebuild. Yeah, right this minute. You know, it's been rebuilt over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
What's there now is a rebuild. So it's not an unusual thing. It's not an unusual thing.
That is, you know, that that is a brilliant takeaway. I'm telling you, because I think I started looking into this not too long ago, actually, and I was shocked to find out that all of these really old style buildings. I've got theories that, anyway, I'm not going to go to my theories right now, but a lot of these old style buildings popped up around the mid 19th century. So the early to the mid 19th century, you had the Greek revival, it was called, and all these buildings that we think are so amazing, Buckingham Palace, Trafalgar Square, the British Museum, most of central London, like you said, just popped up out of thin air over a 50-year period. And you have all of these grand buildings that are so linked to our modern perspective of these civilizations being so old and a lot of what we link to kind of like going to a European city, for instance, Paris, London, we know what we're going to see in terms of the architecture, and it's this that makes us think, wow, this is a great historical place, this place has a legacy. But like you said, these are all rebuilt. None of these buildings have any antiquity to them. So the idea of rebuilding some of Africa's old antiquities that's an amazing that's a really, really amazing thought. But and it's something that we could, and I guess that links to why it would be so important for us to go to the British Museum and get back, like African Nigeria's been trying to do, get back some of our Benin bronzes and things like that, to form part of that rebuild. So go on, you're gonna say.
No, carry on, sir.
No, that was it, really. I just think it's a very exciting thought. It's a real, that's a real kind of tangible blueprint, so to speak. From what you've researched, have attempts been made and curtailed, or has this just been a complete failure on our part in terms of rebuilding Africa?
Okay, to give you an example, the Great Mosque of Jenne, West Africa's most important single monument, was rebuilt in 1906, 1907 by an architect called Ishmael Traore and his team. And what they did was they used the ruins that were already there and just completed them. So it's not an unusual thing to do. And in doing so, they've restored a building that was a mosque in the 13th century, and it was a palace in the 11th century. So essentially, they've restored a medieval monument. And so this is not an unusual thing. And this was Africans that did that. It wasn't anybody else that did that.
That's a fascinating. Yeah, that's pretty exciting for me. I like that. I think that's something we're perhaps going to see some of this in our lifetime.
But let me just jump in though. The main issue though is making sure that African countries have the wealth to be able to afford to do this restoration work. Yeah. So that's very, very important, because if you've got a country that is hard pressed on other issues, history becomes a luxury. And that's why there has to be enough economic surplus so that restoration of historical monuments isn't seen as a luxury, it's seen as a necessity.
And it's an investment. I mean, taking it from someone who's just come from Egypt and an entire economy that is built around the protection and restoration of these monuments and the presentation of these to the rest of the world, that has benefited that nation no end. Being able to protect, I'll say protect in inverted commas, to present, I should say, rather than protect, these ancient antiquities that the entire world wants to see these, and it drives the entire economy. So I think it'd have to be laid out with a very clear, economic business plan, so to speak, for people to understand that this is a necessary investment. And I was just going to dive into, actually, for instance, the Palace of the Oba in Benin, because of the divergent descriptions we have from when the Portuguese talk about it to when the British talk about it. When the Portuguese talk about it, it's humongous. It's this huge, elaborate thing. The palace itself is the size of the city, as you mentioned, 15,000 inhabitants. They're talking about a grand structure that looks better than most of what they see in Europe. And but by the time the British talk about it, there's still some complementary elements to it, but there's a massive downplaying. So something's happened in that 300 to 400 year period
called mass enslavement. That's what that thing is.
Yeah, this is where I'm gonna ask you the question, because you're gonna have some insight as to why those two descriptions were so different from each other.
Yeah, even during the British period, you still get accounts of the Benin Palace being grand. Yeah. Right, let me read to you April 1863. And this is Fraser's magazine, which is a British magazine. And this is a visit to the renowned cities of Wari and Benin by an FRGS. That FRGS is Captain Richard Burton. I want to read it to you. The King's Court or quarter is called Obway. It is a large village, or rather town, separated from the neighboring settlements by streets broader than Parisian squares and appropriated to the royal family, great men, courtiers, and slaves. This part of the city is supposed to contain not less than 15,000 souls. It is in a most ruinous condition. So my man is clear. The reason why it's as it is because it's in a ruinous condition. But what else did we just learn? Streets broader than Parisian boulevards. Yeah, that's powerful. That is powerful. 15,000 people. That we can still call it a village or a separate town. So Captain Richard Burton, 1863, dropped the bomb as far as I'm concerned.
That is dope. Let me ask you a question, and this is for my own personal personal kind of like inquiry here.
Mm-hmm.
Was there, from your research, was there a trend of walled cities in the region we now call kind of Nigeria, Benin? Because everyone
not just Nigeria.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, not just Nigeria.
Yeah, I was going to say kind of like around the whole Guinea.
Yeah, let me answer that.
There seems to be loads of walled cities as a trend. Tell me, yeah, please.
All right. In putting together When We Ruled, one of the books I used as source material was a book that Professor John Jackson used, and the book was called The Martyrdom of Man. And in The Martyrdom of Man, there's a passage where the author says, in Africa, there are thousands of walled cities resembling those of medieval Europe or ancient Greece. Yeah, thousands. According to Lord Lugard, the wife of the legendary Lady Lugard, the person that colonized Nigeria, Lord Lugard says that there are 170 walled settlements in the Kano region alone.
Wow.
Did you hear what I just said? The Kano region alone. Moreover, I came across a book by French agent Captain Louis Banger. And the book, it's got a French title, but in English it roughly means the land of Guinea, the land of the Mossi, the land of Kong. And it's a spy report. And what I did was I scanned the relevant pages of this spy report. And there are blatantly etchings of walled cities, blatantly etchings of fortifications, blatantly etchings of walls. And these cities, castles, and walls are in what we would today call Burkina Faso. So it's an 1892 report.
See, well, that's blown my mind already, because you've spoken about thousands of walled cities. But I did notice that this trend, and it seemed to be like a lot of these narratives that we've attached to different parts of the world seem in Africa and not in those parts of the world, or at least there isn't evidence of them being in different parts of the world. And walled cities is one of them. Africa seemed to be, like you said, a land of walled cities, which is like, we're not taught this. This is not something that we're taught. I've even seen like
let me jump in now. Let me jump in. But there is a negative history to that, because you've got to remember why you would build walled cities in the first place. Why? Because you're being slave raided. Get it?
Is it always a prevention for slave raiding? Walled cities?
It's not always, but because slave raiding was going on, you can't then say that it had nothing to do with it. Do you see? In other words, one of the ways that Africans defended themselves against being slave raided was to build these things.
So you think the walled cities were a response to African contact with Europeans?
They're not all like that, but some of that is a part of the story. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's an important thing that people need to say. By the way, I found the quote, William Winwood Reed. There are thousands of walled villages resembling those of Europe in the Middle Ages or of ancient Greece or of Italy before the supremacy of Rome, encircled by pastures and arable estates and by farming villages. With their villagiatura, their municipal government, their agora or forum, their fortified houses, and their feuds and street frays of Capulet and Montague. What about that for a quote, fam? What about that for a quote? That was William Winwood Reed.
Amazing. Let's talk about, I could talk about the walled cities. I could go on a bit, to be honest with you, but I kind of want to jump back to something that you said earlier before it kind of escapes my mind. because you spoke about Burkina Faso having these wars around, and you spoke earlier about Africa being home to the world's earliest textiles. And
that's right. Yeah.
So I'm relating two disparate points here. I'll land because I think back to one of
Okay,
the.
let me just jump in though, just before you make your point. The earliest textiles aren't in West Africa; they're in East Africa. The world's first cotton, is Sudan, 6,000 years BC. Yeah, just saying.
Let me land really quickly then, okay? Because it was two very different points. So I guess the point I was making was that when Thomas Sankara took power and renamed, what was it called before he renamed it Burkina Faso? Upper Volta, thank you. Renamed Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. One of the first things he did, and this is one of the reasons why he's probably one of my greatest, if not greatest, heroes in terms of modern African Renaissance, was he rebuilt rebuilt a version of African's textile industry, and they decided, no, we're going to wear our own textiles. We're going to manufacture our own. And I think he only had one color or something like that. And he made everyone wear it across government. But it was such an important thing to do because A, Africa needed its own manufacturing. But B, there is a historical legacy on the African continent of textile. And I know I'm going around the circles a little bit here, but looking through historically, particularly looking at some of the illustrations, Africans had such an intimate relationship to the clothing. You know, when I read a quote where they speak about the fact that the Africans look like the Grecian statues, look like the Roman statues. That's what the Europeans used to say when they used to meet them, and their robes. And we all are very familiar with kind of like modern African textiles, many of which are being manufactured in Asia. And we have this kind of like modern perspective, and I love the Kente cloth, the factual designs, this, that, and the other. But there's a historical legacy of Africans producing their own, and they would produce, all white garments. They would produce like all of these different textiles, but it's all being manufactured on the African continent, and that has been lost, or at least we're in a process of regaining it. I hope we can regain it, but that is a big thing that has been lost. Jumping back to the point that you made, and now just letting you finish it off completely, about what have you picked up and learned about Africa and its relationship to textiles from kind of its inception and over time to where we are now?
Okay, let me just throw in a few concepts. The beginnings of cotton, as I said, is Sudan. The spindle whorls have been found. Professor Christopher Eret speaks on them. Professor Toby Green wrote an article for the Daily Telegraph where he drops that knowledge. So that's the beginnings of cotton in the world, the oldest examples of cotton.
Amazing.
Okay, now.
So I'm going to ask you for a date or a range or an idea, if you have it.
Well, what are you going to say? No, say what you said.
So a date. Do you have a date roughly for when?
It's 6,000 BC.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. All right. So 6,000 BC. So what was I saying now before I was so rudely interrupted? So that's the beginnings of textiles. Yeah. Then of course you've got the Nubia and Kush thing. And we know the kind of textiles they had because some of them are in the Petrie Museum. You can see some of the linen dresses that are still in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. So you've got stuff like that. Then we have places like Ethiopia, what is today called Ethiopia. There used to be a kingdom called Da'amat, which is the oldest kingdom in the region. and there is a statue, and I took the photograph of the statue, so again, no one can't come test me, of a queen, and the sculpture was made between the 9th century BC and the 6th century BC, and the queen is clearly wearing a pleated dress. Right?
Is that a pleated dress?
Pleated dress.
Okay.
Yeah. And that sculpture is in the Addis Ababa Museum. Right, then we have in places like West Africa, there is an account by a geographer called El Bekri, and he describes the horses of the king of Ghana, caparisoned in cloth of gold. So we can infer that it would have been cotton cloth with gold stitched through it. And this is in an 11th century source. Then there's a site in the Bandiagara cliffs from the 11th century where a whole bunch of textiles were found in very, very complicated weave patterns. And these 11th century textiles are in the Bamako Museum in Mali. I visited that museum, I saw those textiles. So there are 11th century textiles. Moving to Ethiopia, when we visited the city of Lalibela, the underground city of churches, there's a museum attached to the Lalibela Center. And that museum had the cloaks of King Lalibela. And if those are authentic and original cloaks, those cloaks will be 12th century. Are you feeling this?
Yeah.
There has recently been in Sudan fragments of textiles that have been found, again, from the same period, where, again, it's cotton and the gold has been stitched through it. And the golden textiles have survived. So it's not they're in a document. No, they've actually found the actual textiles. Now, during the 19th century, Kano in Nigeria was the center of the textile industry. So people all over West Africa were wearing Kano cloth. So, you know, the big garments, I think people in southern Nigeria call them agbada. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But they're actually the ones from Hausa land, from Nupe. Those went all over West Africa. So that you would be in Dahomey, modern Benin, and somebody collected one of those textiles from Dahomey because it was given to him as a present to take back to Britain. And it came from Dahomey, but it wasn't originally Dahomey, it was originally Hausaland. Mm-hmm. You see? And then in the case of the Kente cloth you talked about from Ghana, originally the people from that region imported silken cloths, unstitched them, rewove them in the Kente patterns, and then that became their textile. So they were wearing silken textiles that had been unraveled and rewoven in those Kente patterns. And we know this because this is what's described in Mission from Cape Coast to Ashanti, the 1819 book by Thomas Bowditch, 1819. He was there in 1817. Do you see?
Amazing. That was,
and those are the only examples because eyewitnesses to the Swahilis in 1500s, when the Portuguese got there, mentioned them wearing cotton, silk, camlets, etc., etc. Yeah, so we've got those in the documents as well.
That is really insightful. Thank you very much. That was a very, very in-depth answer. So Africa clearly has this very intimate relationship, and I think that it's just like there's several arms of what makes a people, what makes a culture, what makes a history, and all of these are interwoven. Because I think it's so often that we are obsessed with the massive hallmarks of civilization, i.e., big stone buildings. That's really kind of like one of the big stone building. There must have been a great civilization here. As soon as they find a temple or something, they'll instantly mark it civilization. But the absence of a big stone building doesn't necessarily denote the absence of a culture, a civilization, a advanced group of people doing certain things.
Let me answer that. But you see, this is what people forget, because the monuments elsewhere in Africa were big. You see, people assume that Kemet is the only place in Africa. Remember the palace we've been talking about, the Obwe, the Royal Palace of Benin. That's 15,000 people. The Royal Palace complex of Dahomey was 8,000 people. These are big structures. Do you see? Now, just because they're not made of stone, they're still grand structures. And what it is, you have to build what's appropriate for the environment. And clay bricks have a cooling effect on the inside of a building. So it is logical to build with clay bricks. You see, it doesn't make what you have inferior. Similarly, one of the grandest monuments in Sweden is an old wooden church. Now, wood doesn't make what they've built primitive. It means what they've built is appropriate to their environment. Most architecture in America is wood, not stone. You see? Yeah? But what it is there's this whole attempt to big up stone, especially if it's not in Africa, and shrink clay, especially if it is in Africa. And we shouldn't let them get away with playing that game. After all, the cottages in England, the most venerated building in England is a thatched cottage, right? What's a thatched cottage? It's a mud hut. But because they've called it thatched cottage, they've given it a quaint English grandeur.
Yeah. I love the way for that. Yeah, absolutely. But even thinking about what you were just saying there, even in our naming of historical epochs, you can see this language in. Think about like we call it what period of history did this take place in? The Paleolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age. These are all naming, or these are all these are all naming conventions based on clearly what is prioritized by this kind of like version of history. What were they doing with stone? And it's like, why is, I don't know, in some ways, why is that so important? And me saying this is not saying this as I'm not saying this as a reaction to say Africans weren't using stone or building stone buildings. I 100% believe Africans have always had stone buildings as far back as we can go through Africa's history. But there still is that tendency to say, we're so quick to label something a civilization the moment we find the moment we find a stone upright that should be lying down in the mud. It's like, this stone is upright, new civilization found. It just seems to be like a human, or at least definitely an archaeological trend to really rate any time stones have been piled up on top of each other, as opposed to things that are probably don't last as long as stone. I don't know. It's something I've noticed.
You're right. But even if we want to look at West African history, the prehistory of ancient Ghana, medieval Mali, the Songhai Empire, there's a site called Dar Tichit Walata, and that site is 2000 BC, and that site is stone, right? And if you pull up a picture of Dar Tichit Walata, it looks very slightly Great Zimbabwe-ish. In terms of the way the stone structures have been built. And that's 2000 BC.
So I want to talk a little bit about what you spoke about at the start of this conversation. You were essentially talking about the way Africa has been carved up since the Berlin Conference, and we've got all of these names. and these places largely been either named arbitrarily or sometimes inherited something from their European colonizer, or sometimes in an effort to um, pay homage to something that they thought was a great civilization. They've randomly given its name to another place. You see all that taking place. Now, in terms of Africa and its modern borders and its modern names, in comparison to prior to the colonization of the continent, however you want to phrase it, what are some of the standout correspondences between names, and what are some of the biggest deceptions in terms of how names have changed? Because I think this has a massive impact on the way we view history, but it would be good to hear from you. Looking at an old map and a current map of Africa, what are some of the biggest changes, and why do you think those occurred, and what impact have they had?
Okay. All the way along the East African coast, from what is today Somalia, through Kenya, through Tanzania, through Mozambique, all of that used to be the Swahili Confederation. In some of the books, they used to call it the land of Zenj. Zenj is part of the word Zanzibar. And the land of Zenj, the word Zenj is approximately, if you were to translate that, that would come out as Negro. One of the words that Turkish people call black people is Zenci, which is coming from the word Zenj. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's one example that we can point to, where that is now, this region has been split into 4 countries, where one bit of it is Somalia, one bit of it is Kenya, one bit of it is Tanzania, one bit of it is Mozambique. And this is the direct consequence of the European colonizers grabbing this piece of land, that piece of land, this piece of land, that piece of land. Yeah, you'll get situations like that. Then you've got in Southern Africa what used to be the Empire of Munu-Mutapa. English language books say Monomotapa, and that would be approximately where Zimbabwe, where South Africa, particularly the Transvaal region, that was all part of it too. So it was a huge empire in Southern Africa. A part of it was Mozambique, inland, not the coast. The coast was Swahili, inland was the Empire of Mulu-Mutapa. This heritage has now been split across 3 different countries. So Great Zimbabwe is in modern Zimbabwe. Mozambique has got some of its own monuments. South Africa has got some of its own monuments. But until very recently, because South Africa was under apartheid, they didn't let the world know that there were stone monuments in South Africa. Does that make sense? Because they wanted to keep that quiet, to disassociate black people in South Africa with anything civilized. So you will get situations like that. So Zimbabwe today is named after Great Zimbabwe. Precisely what it means is controversial, but it could mean great revered houses of stone. Yeah, that's what Zimbabwe means. Other African countries, Nigeria and Niger are both named after the Niger River. Right? Sudan is the country, it simply means land of blacks. Ethiopia means land of burnt-faced people. So a disproportionate number of black countries are named after this notion of black. Mali is named after the medieval Mali Empire. Guinea is a European term for West Africa, but whether they got it from us or not is we can debate. Congo is the name of an ancient kingdom. So different places have different names, but the significance is very, very much countries that didn't exist were put together, countries that did exist were split apart, heritages that belong to one group of people end up being split across 2, 3, 4 boundaries. Do you see? All of that stuff happened.
That's very interesting. Ethiopia is a name that tracks well all the way back to ancient Greece,
Yeah.
and was a name associated largely with the African continent
Yeah. Hmm.
up until I think it was the was it Haile Selassie who decided to name the nation Ethiopia? I think was it Abyssinia before then? I'm not sure.
It went between the two. It went between the two, but certainly, yes, you're right.
But it was a name that used to be associated with the continent, and you can see this quite a lot on old maps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
True.
if you look at the location of what they classified as the Ethiopic Sea or the
Yeah.
Ethiopic
Yeah.
Ocean, where we had the Atlantic, I've
Yeah.
always found it interesting that that's
Yeah.
on the opposite side of where Ethiopia is at the moment.
Yeah.
So I guess it's one of those things like why had they transported this name, which seemed to have a continental impact? Because you had greater. I think no, you had not minor or major. I think it was. I think some maps it says Upper Ethiopia, some it says Lower. Some maps it says Ethiopia Superior, being the northern region, and Ethiopia Inferior, being the southern region of Ethiopia. But it's
Hmm.
definitely tracks across many maps, and now it's just given to the nation that's the kind of the furthest east in
Yeah.
Africa.
Hmm. Hmm.
How much of that, once again, I guess is that deliberate or just happenstance
Yeah.
of
Let me answer that. Let me answer.
colonization? What's your thoughts around that?
As you rightly say, the term Ethiopia was one of the terms for the whole of Africa, right? But not just Africa. There were parts of what would today be considered Asia that were also considered to be Ethiopia. And roughly speaking, the term Ethiopia means land where black people are at. Yeah. The actual translation is Ethiop, which means the burnt faced people. So when the Greeks visited the southern part of India, they also called that Ethiopia. When they visited parts of Arabia, they also called that Ethiopia. Why? Because burnt faced people were there. So it's not just Africa, although you're right, Ethiopia is a name that could refer to the whole of Africa. And generally speaking, during the slave trade, you will get black people being called the Spanish word for black, negro. But if you were considered elite in some way, as happened with Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker, in some of the records I've seen, is described as an Ethiopian, not a Negro. Does that make sense? It's almost like he's been, if you're a slave, you're a Negro. If you're not, you're an Ethiopian. I don't know how that works. All right, now sometimes the ancient Greeks used the term Ethiopia to refer to one country in Africa, and that country was south of Egypt, which on a modern map would have been Sudan. So when the ancient Greeks talked about Ethiopia as one particular country, what they meant by that was Sudan. And then, of course, you've got the modern country called Ethiopia. The modern country is not the same as the ancient Ethiopia. Ancient Ethiopia is mostly Sudan, but they all mean the same thing, land of burnt faces.
Okay. I guess a quick thought about that. Have you come across the appellation for Zeus, where he's called Zeus Ethiops?
I've heard of this. I've never actually seen it,
Okay, yeah.
but
So
I've
there's
heard of this.
the I guess it's been discussed that Zeus Ethiop was the earliest appellation that was given to Zeus. That's what they used to call him, Zeus Ethiops, and then over time it became abbreviated just to Zeus. And I've always found this quite interesting. My internet keeps hope it holds up. Sorry. Um, historically we know from the Iliad that it was said that Zeus would dine with the Ethiopians, or that's where he would go and have consort with the gods in Ethiopia. So then a friend said this to me, and he kind of just threw it out there, because is it perhaps that Ethiopian itself means to be related to Zeus? As in, then the name Zeus Ethiops came first, and therefore the place where Zeus hailed from in terms of Greek ideology, so to speak, but the place where Zeus hailed from was this place that they therefore were called the Ethiopians. It was just an interesting kind of thought that I didn't think about. I was like, I have no idea. Is it a possibility? I don't know. What's your thoughts on something like that?
Okay, let me give you the answer. In my opinion, they are connected, but I wouldn't have connected them that way. The connection, in my opinion, is if you asked the ancient Egyptians who were the people of Sudan, one of the names they gave Sudan is Ta-Neta, land of God, or land of the deities, whatever. And if you know anything about ancient Egyptian deities, we know for a fact that Osiris was considered to have come from Cush. We know for a fact that Shu and Tefnut were considered to have come from Cush. We know for a fact that many of the deities, Amen, etc., they came from the south. So what happened was, in fact, let me get the source and I'll come back to you. If you hold this, I'm going to go and get the source, because you need to hear this, because a bomb is about to get dropped. Yeah?
All right.
Okay, so I think I said something about the ancient Egyptians called Sudan. One of the names they called Sudan was Ta-Neta, meaning land of God or land of the gods or whatever. And many of the deities of ancient Egypt have Sudanese origins. Okay. All right. Now, here is a British school book, and it's called The Roman Empire, and it's Heinemann History Study Units. I don't know if you're in your history days, you ever came across this book?
I wouldn't say it looks dissimilar. They all look the same to me, so maybe. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to turn to this page here, and it's called Barbarians. How did the ancient Romans see non-Romans? And I'm going to read source E. This is on page 31, and it will tie everything I've just said together. Source E. The kingdom of Ethiopia is a fertile and rich wonderland, possessing an abundance of gold, and the royal family descended from the gods, from a Roman geography book written in about AD 250. We feeling that?
Yeah, that's that's real ancient history. Nice. Yeah.
Right, so we can connect it then. Ask the ancient Egyptians, and they'll tell you that the people of Sudan, their country is the land of God. Ask the Romans, they will tell you that the Kushite royal family is descended from the gods. And now we have a theory of why Zeus would prefer to receive the sacrifices of the Kushites, because he's receiving sacrifices from the people whose royal family descends from the gods, according to Roman belief, which is in this geography book, which has been reproduced in a mainstream British historical context.
Nice. Always good to have the sources. History is an amazing thing when when bias is removed. It kind of brings us back to the entire argument that Martin Banal raised about the classical model versus I think he called it the Aryan model, which is what kind of Western ideology is adopted now and got, because if you look back, would you say it's accurate to say ancient Greece and ancient Rome had no problem giving credit to Africa? Because I've seen it seemed to be the case. It's go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, true. What you've just said there is absolutely true. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans are, to use the modern phrase, called a spade a spade. You know? This is what it is. When Eurocentric scholarship developed in the 18th century, there was a first wave of scholars. I call them the Orientalists. Now, my use of the term the Orientalist is different to everybody else's use. Everybody else is copying that Palestinian intellectual who says Orientalism is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's an honest thing. So your Orientalists were people like, in France, Count Constantin de Volney. In Wales, people like Sir William Jones. And these writers began re-examining the classics of Greece and Rome. And what they discovered was Black people. And they discovered Black people in the history recorded by the Greeks and the Romans in respectable positions. So the idea that the ancient Egyptians were Black people, the Greeks and the Romans both say that. The idea that there were Black populations in Arabia, Persia, etc., etc., etc. The Greeks and Romans say all of this. And so Black people were part of the respectable commentary on history from Greco-Roman sources. And then what happened, one branch of Orientalism split off and became Egyptology. And the father of Egyptology, as you know, is Jean-Francois Champollion. And while he doesn't use the term Negro, he does say the ancient Egyptians are just like the modern day people of Nubia. He does say that, right? So that's Egyptology dealt with as far as I'm concerned. Then another branch broke off and became Assyriology. And this was started by, he later became General Sir Henry Rawlinson, but originally he was Colonel Sir Henry Rawlinson. And Colonel Rawlinson makes it quite clear that the original inhabitants of what is today Iraq were Hamites. And what he means by Hamites is from Africa. And then that's now the birth of Assyriology, which then developed into Sumerian studies and all the rest of it. And then the third branch of Orientalism was the archaeologists. And so the archaeologists began digging these places up, etc., etc., etc. And the respect for the Greeks and the Romans and what they had to say was in place. Now, the attack on the Greek and Roman scholarship and the attack on the original wave of Orientalists to produce this Aryan model, I don't think it happened the way Martin Bernal said it happened, but something like that definitely did happen. And what the phraseology I prefer to use is not the birth of the Aryan model. I prefer to call it the birth of fake history.
Pragmatic, because that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have an obvious question, but with an obvious answer, we're going to ask it anyway. What was the motive?
What was the motive? If you read books in the 19th century, and I've got a big collection of 19th century history books, even when they are being disrespectful to Black people, they will kind of admit that you were there. So I have a children's book called The Student's Ancient History. And The Student's Ancient History is by Philip Smith. It was published in 1871. And he fudges a lot of issues, but he sort of, he says, yes, the ancient Egyptians were sort of Negroes. Yeah. He doesn't fully commit, but sort of, yes, sort of, you can have that. His Sumerians were Chaldeans, And those Chaldeans, he says, hasn't everyone heard of this empire emanating from Kush? That's him describing the Sumerians. When it comes to describing the people that we would now call Elamites, he says the Indian and Persian legends tell us that there was a black population already there with woolly hair. That's your Elamites. Do you see? This is an 1871 book. So the real era of propaganda where black people disappear entirely from ancient history isn't a 19th century thing, it's a 20th century thing. But what 20th century scholars did was to fake the funk and tell everybody, no, that wasn't our generation. That was the 18th century, that was the 19th century. No, it wasn't. It was the 20th century. So you could find the book in the 19th century that says the ancient Egyptians were sort of black people. You can't find a 20th century book that says that. You could find a 19th century book that says that the Moorish culture in Spain was sort of something to do with Africa. You can't find a 20th century book that says that. Yeah. So the real suppression of black history was a 20th century suppression. It wasn't a 19th century suppression, despite the claim that it was.
You see, I 100% resonate with what you just said there, because I've reached the same conclusion.
Yeah.
But then that raises a larger and a more troubling question.
Yeah.
And this is a somewhat political question, so feel free to answer it or not answer it if you wish. But this now raises the suggestion that, at least in the field of history, academia, and anthropology, has gotten more racist since the abolition of slavery.
Correct.
Can we rationalize that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. This is what it is. In the 19th century, yes, black people outside Africa were all either slaves or descended from slaves. Black people outside Africa could be looked down upon, discriminated against, and all kinds of horrible things could happen to a black person outside Africa. But Africa itself hadn't been conquered yet. By the time we get to the 20th century, with the exception of Ethiopia, with the exception of Haiti, every black person was under lock and key by the time we get to the 20th century. And that is where the concerted effort was made to remove black people from all history. So this is how it was done. The ancient history, where black people were in places like ancient Egypt, ancient Carthage, that type of history simply got lied about. And how that was done was they had to attack certain ancient historians like Herodotus and Diodorus and accuse those scholars of being liars. They had to mistranslate certain hieroglyphic documents. So the hieroglyphic NHSI, which means from a place in Kush, was mistranslated as Negro. So when the ancient Egyptians banned people from that part of Kush, NHSI, from entering Egypt, that was then claimed, see, that's Negroes been banned from entering Egypt. The ancient Egyptians couldn't have been Negroes. Then you had the Sumerians ended up white in the 20th century. I've got the old books. They were black in the 19th century. They became white in the 20th century. The Elamites, which was the original inhabitants of Iran, they remained black, but what the scholars did with Elam is just simply zip it. Let's not say anything about Elam. So the fact that they have a grand ziggurat, the Choga Zambil ziggurat, still standing, yeah, just zip it, say nothing. And that's still the mainstream perspective. So that way they don't have to lie about Elam, just say nothing, zip it. And then the civilizations in Africa proper belittle all of them and find a strategy to belittle all of them. So the empires of Mali and Songhai say, well, they were Islamic. So yeah, okay, they were black, but that don't mean it's yours because it's Islamic. Do the same thing with the Swahilis. Lie about Great Zimbabwe. You know that Zimbabwe being Rhodesia, you know that Rhodesian historians were not allowed to say that black people built Great Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
They were not allowed to say that. And this information, you can read about it. Dr. Peter Garlake wrote a book called Great Zimbabwe, and it's in one of the footnotes because he had to leave the country when he announced that, no, black people built this. So the Rhodesian police got on his case and he ended up leaving the country. And then the next strategy was, anytime you found something in Africa that was grand, say that black people had nothing to do with it. And by doing this, they created a concept called the true Negro hypothesis, which said that every population in Africa, except West Africa, is mixed with something else. And that meant they were true Negroes. And then in places like Yoruba land, where those exquisite sculptures were found in the city of Ife, and they clearly show Africans, come with some reasoning why it wasn't Africans that did it. It was a Roman that ended up there that make, come with any kind of rubbish to belittle the history. And that is how we black people entered the 20th century. The 20th century was the era where that was the standard history. And that's why our pioneers, J.A. Rogers, our pioneers, Drusilla Dungy Houston, our pioneers, Professor William Leo Hansberry, had to begin the fight back. One of our pioneers, Professor W.E.B. Du Bois, had to begin the fight back. And that fight back has eventually produced me.
That was thank you for that. It's frustrating to hear you talk about this, because in the back of my mind, the biggest question I continue to ask myself is why. I get the how, and I get the when, and I even get the what they were doing, but it still raises the big question as to why they felt the need to take everything. They were already colonized. Why? What frustrates me more is that it feels like it's a continuation of this. Unfortunately, modern academicians in certain fields, particularly anthropology, which is one of the most backwards fields that there are in science, continue to build on these foundations of lies and racism and actually develop on them, rather than, just like we were talking about earlier about the way genetics are being analyzed. It's completely biased. They know exactly what they're doing in terms of they use certain arrays that will amplify European relationships and will make all Africans seem distant. They do things very deliberately that aren't done in other fields of genetics, by the way. Only population geneticists do these. So,
Of course.
But the thing is, they are building more lies upon these lies, and they're having to extend these lies, and they're having to create.
Let me answer that. I'm still not pessimistic, and I'll tell you why. The internet age and the AI age has given our scholars, I can talk about myself, the best opportunity to research our history, because the old literature is now at our fingertips. Why I was able to get those images of castles, forts, and so on from that French spy report is because that book is now online. why I've been able to, I did a presentation for Happy, HAPI, the African American company. I did a presentation on Elam, the civilization of the Elamites. And I was able to get hold of Monsieur Dieulafoy's original report. I have it, it's on my hard drive. And okay, but the report's in French. Because of AI, I can now read that report. Do you see? And being in that position really does change the game. And I implore any of the young scholars that want to research this type of history, it is now the easiest to research this type of history than it has ever been, because the literature is the most available now, especially the old stuff. And so being able to gatekeep that history is harder now than it has ever been to gatekeep that history. So even if geneticists come with their nonsense, we don't have to listen to what they have to say, provided that we have a solid anthropological base to build on. Because what will then end up happening is they're going to put themselves in very embarrassing situations.
Which is why
you've got 19th century sources going all the way up to relatively recently, and then the most modern source says no, they're not black. But you haven't discounted all this earlier stuff. Do you see? And this is where I think we will win this. We will win this debate.
I agree. You said a phrase earlier, the true Negro hypothesis. And this is something that I speak about quite a lot on my channel. Just in the aspect of this idea of there being a single archetypal Negro type, and essentially everyone is a hybrid. And the irony being that, our sciences have already proved that Black people are the archetypal race, and therefore, we should be speaking about a true Nordic or a true Mongol Chinese or something. I don't know, but we don't. We speak about a true Negro, and then the idea that all Black people are mixed. It's almost like there's the entire history of mankind has been turned upside down. And
transparent why they did that. Pretty transparent. There was something I used to use as teaching material, right? And let me see if I can find it right now. There was a book that I used to use as teaching material, and it's called Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. And if I can find this, I will quote it to you, and you will see for yourself just how transparent the whole kind of lying was. And it's humorous just how transparent the lying was. Let me see if I can find it. I don't think I have it anymore. This is what it was. It was a feminist encyclopedia, and they have an entry where they're describing the pygmies. And in that entry, they described the pygmies as white people. Did you hear what I just said? And then at the end of the quote, they explain why they said the pygmies were white, because they said that the ancient Egyptians had the same body shape as the pygmies. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm going with that?
Eurocentric logic. I'm sorry. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And that's the level that they pushed it to try to remove Black people from history. As Chancellor Williams says, when people do this, it's not just racist, it's humorous. I have to admit, I find this stuff funny where people do it, where you have to go to the point of total ridiculousness.
All those white Kwene
That's right.
and
That's right. That's right.
people in Africa right now. I'm going to be very interested to learn that they are members of the white race. Those Twa in Rwanda. Well.
Okay, I've got it. I've got it. Barbara G. Walker, Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, published in the United States by Harper and Row, 1983. Yeah? And we've got here the extract on pygmies, and this is the third paragraph. I'm going to read it to you. Like their relatives, the Bushmen, pygmies are Caucasoid people, thin-lipped, light-skinned, often blue-eyed. Anthropological investigations show the pygmies were not true primitives, but remnants of a formerly sophisticated race, the Proto-Berber people inhabiting what Hallett called Old White Africa. Pygmies have about the same stature as Egyptian mummies. Boom! Boom!
Hilarious.
In
It's
it.
hilarious. And it's funny how you only need one trait, because obviously they clearly made up the blue eyes thing, because very few pygmies have blue eyes. I'm not saying it's totally unheard of, but it's like as rare as it is in any other African population. The only thing they pick up is maybe some pygmies, like some of the Kwene, and when I say some, I'm not saying all, have lighter skin than your average, lighter, but not outside the range of what one of you and I's aunties might look like, by the way, Robin. Still very much within the range of Black Africans. But that's enough. That's enough. They they miss out the fact that pygmies have probably the broadest nasal index out of any Africans.
That's right. That's right.
Blackest noses. Then it's like all these other things that you would classify someone a Negro. They ignore all of that. The tightest hair, more than 4 C's, like literally the tightest coiled hair out of any African groups is found amongst the Khoisan or the Kwene people. They've missed out as well. It's just the delusion. It's hard to put into words what kind of mind state do you have to be in to write that. It's like me going and picking up a song from Iceland and being like, this is the definite depiction of a the original Negro race. You can see here with the
That's right. That's right.
Broad face, only found in amongst African people.
Yeah, I mean, and so when I used to teach this, I learned this from Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan. You scan the page so people can see that you've not taken anything out of context. You see, yeah, because people have to see this stuff. This is teaching material.
And this is the basis, this is the foundation, unfortunately, that many of these other fields are building their research upon.
That's right.
And
that's right.
This stuff just needs to be completely and utterly, I'd say most of it, completely and utterly thrown out. And I guess this is where my question I asked you originally comes back into this conversation about this. I guess this is why I don't push for a unified curriculum, because I feel like this kind of ignorance is always going to persist. I just feel like
we can shut it down.
Their own
agenda. No. Let me answer that. If you were to trace the history of exactly what you've just said, it's about 100-year history. Yeah. And if something only lasts for 100 years, it can be erased at some point. So I do believe that more truthful versions of history will become more mainstream. And I know this from my own experience. The fact that some of my most recent books have been put out by mainstream companies. And it wasn't because I was begging them, it's they came to me. So you might think, well, how do you get real Black history into the hands of school children? There's a book that I wrote. Let me see if I can find it right here. Right, this is a book aimed at school children. And the book, as they say in Jamaica, isn't ramping. Yeah. And yes, the ancient Egyptians are in the book. Yes, African glory is in the book. Yeah. So this has been mainstreamed. Let me show you another book. This book is mainstreamed. Yeah. And so, Kemet is in here. The kingdom of Nubia, Tarseti, is in here. So again, these sorts of stories have been allowed, if you like, to get through. This is mainstream stuff, bro.
Good. I mean, I guess the question is, I guess I always think along the lines of curriculum, which is because I think, the ability for Black history, African history to be mainstream, I think is not, I guess we have to define what we mean by mainstream. Because it's once again, I guess for me, it comes down to, when I think about it from a academic point of view, as in when you're in school, I'm thinking about key stage 2, 3, 4, 5, the kind of like the height from primary school to the end of high school, the key stages.
Okay, let's deal with key stage 2.
What's being taught and who's teaching it, more than something being available. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Can you see that?
I can see it. Go on.
From Narmer's Kemet to Cleopatra's Egypt, right? This was produced by, I wrote it, it was published by the African Heritage Forum. And this we have made available to schools, and we've done it as a heritage lottery thing where it's mainstreamed. So you can download this, you see, yeah? So the idea was to produce key stage 2 material, upper primary school, so that if people want to learn about ancient Egypt, and we've been totally uncompromising, we call it Kemet. We use all the African names. So we don't say Memphis, we say Mennefer. We don't say Thebes, we say Waset. We do give the names of the deities, such as Osiris, but then we give the African names as well. And then, so in presenting something, so this is mainstream, just saying.
No,
so one thing is that they're not the immovable force that they were in the 20th century.
I agree, yeah. And like I said, I don't doubt, I mean, certainly I know your books have definitely been integrated more and more mainstream as time has gone on. And I'm definitely not undermining that contribution. For me, once again, it's just boiling down to curriculum. That's the kind of the key thing that I was specifically speaking about, is curriculum and what gets taught to children, when they walk into that classroom in year 8, and it's the curriculum. They've got a few headline things that they need to be touched on. When they go to teach, for instance, the ancient Egyptian civilization, do they pick up Robin Walker's book, which teaches it accurately from an African perspective, or do they still default to the textbook that they always have done? And I guess that's what I'm talking about when it comes to curriculum. I think accessibility, you definitely working towards that job. But if we're going to get a curriculum, do you ever see a stage where there's a unified curriculum? And when I talk about unified curriculum, I mean, okay, you teach all your English history, your this, that. But then when you're teaching about ancient Egypt, you teach it under an African canopy.
Yeah, let me answer that.
Speak to it as a Black civilization as opposed to something else.
Yeah, let me answer that. The history of the development of how we revolutionize school teaching, that history goes back to the Americans, the African Americans, who created the Portland model baseline essays. Do you know about these?
No, go ahead, please. I don't.
Okay. What happened was, before the days of the Trumpsters, radicals produced a curriculum that really did include the ethnic contributions of the people in your classroom. And they commissioned intellectuals to write on the African contributions, the Native American contributions, the Asian American contributions. And these essays are available online. You can download them quite easily. They're called the Portland Model Baseline Essays. So what did they do? Well, they commissioned Professor John Henrik Clarke to write the social science essay, which would then form the basis of how you teach African history. They commissioned a scholar to write the same type of thing, but how you would teach mathematics. They commissioned Hunter Haviland Adams to how would you teach science subjects. And schools had the option of they could download these essays and the teachers could avail themselves of the information. Now, there was a massive media backlash and they rubbished these essays. They rubbished them, they dissed them, they dissed them, they dissed them, they dissed them. And this was part of an anti-Afrocentric hysteria that had been pumped up in the wake of the book. There's an anti-Afrocentric book called Not Out of Africa by Professor Mary Lefkowitz. Yeah, and part of that Not Out of Africa campaign resulted in these essays being dissed. Now, those essays, you read them today, and they contain errors here and there, but the basis behind them is rock solid. So what first of all, my tutor, the very great Dr. Femi Biko, we used those essays when we were building a Saturday school. So we had a Saturday school, we used those essays. And then influenced by those essays, my research has been, can we update the science teaching? Can we update the history teaching? Can we update the maths teaching? Do you see? And this has been my area of research, to update these things. And so when we update these things, it's not just how we change the teaching of history. It's going to be how we change the history of maths, how we change the history of science. Do you see? Because a lot of maths ideas and principles attributed to this ancient Greek or that ancient Roman, they got it secondhand.
Yeah.
You see? And so this way is how we revolutionize African-centered teaching. And that, if you like, continued revolution in African-centered teaching is what I'm bringing to the game. So I've written 3 volumes on Black people in science. The ancient Egyptian contributions, the contributions from outside Africa, and then the African American and diasporan contributions. So what it now means is literature exists. Now, I'm not saying my work is the final word on it. It's not. No doubt people can look at the work and do better than me, but this is how. So when it comes to a unified curriculum, then it's not just history that has to change. It's all the subjects, because just as Eurocentrism is the basis of history teaching, Eurocentrism is the basis of all the other subjects with the same problems that come about because of it. Do you see?
Yeah. That's very eye-opening what you said there. One of the things that it raises to me as maybe a better, I'm not going to say better because it's a good approach, but I guess an alternative and perhaps more fruitful approach. How much work is being done with African curriculums where the I guess the ground is more fertile for a vision from the ground up, as
Let me
opposed to
answer that.
an established curriculum like the British one, where they're going to be stubborn about changing anything that they do.
That's just it, bro. They're not as stubborn as you think. That's what I'm trying to tell you. They're stubborn, but they're not as stubborn as you think. Yeah. But anyway, let's talk about Africa. Yes, with African countries, you've got very similar problems because Eurocentrism is entrenched there too. Yeah. And certainly me and my team, we will produce material that will go after the African continent as well. So trust me, we working on that. So just cool, we working on that.
Cool. I guess my thoughts about the stubbornness is just, once again, just it's not that I think anything's immovable. I always have this massive layer of distrust in the ability, because it's all good when you're in a classroom or when you're given something, but I've seen the amount of damage. For instance, a majority of teachers in the British Isles, so to speak, and that's as an experience as a teacher. I've taught loads of schools across the country.
Real talk. I've seen the same thing.
Yeah, I've seen the amount of damage that they've done with a curriculum that wasn't that bad in terms of a Black history curriculum, but the amount of damage they've done just wanting to teach it a certain way, and it going from being something that has had so much potential to being a class that Black children dread.
Yeah.
Nationwide, they dread Black history being taught. That's what has been done with it. Do you understand what I mean? So it's kind of like I almost feel like it doesn't. Does it even? How much can we? Even if we gave you something that was a good curriculum and that was almost infallible in its in its learning objectives and its assessment points and its outcomes, I still don't trust you as a vessel to deliver it, because you've got so much. True. Do you understand what I mean? And I guess that's always what's playing in the back.
Let me answer that though. As an entrepreneur, my attitude is not it can't be done. My attitude is how can it be done? And I believe there are ways that we can get closer and closer to foolproof. Yeah. And my job is to produce curricular materials that meet the national curriculum that are as close as possible to being foolproof. And that way, I'm a firm believer in taking teacher belief, teacher bias, teacher personality out of the classroom as far as possible. Because my view is, if you structure the content in a particular way, it's very difficult for a teacher to undermine it. So the work that I've done, seriously, the work that I've done with my colleagues, we did a book on Black British history, Black influences on British culture. If you engage with that book, it's very difficult to undermine the content and still deliver your classes. Do you see? So let me give you an example of what I mean. All right, let me give you an example. All right, we did this book here. It's called Black British History, Black Influences on British Culture, right? And if you turn to any one particular page, right, you've got your heading, you've got your learning objectives, you've got your course content, you've got your sources, because it's source analysis, and then you've got your questions and answers. Yeah, that's a double page. That's 1 hour's worth of work. And then elsewhere in the book, you've got the images that go with this particular topic. Right. Once children are engaging with this, even if you have a teacher trying to undermine, it's very difficult to undermine, because the kids still have to read these questions, still have to read these texts, still have to, do you see? Otherwise they can't produce the work. And so we make it such that when it comes to what is required of a teacher, all you need to do is press play. And that way it takes out bias. Now, the only way that a teacher can undermine it is simply not do it. Do you see? But once this is integrated into the scheme of work, and the different classes are integrated into the scheme of work, if a teacher doesn't do it, now they have a disciplinary problem on their hands. Yeah. So that's why I'm a firm believer that any problem, any difficulty, it's not it can't be done. The question I want to know as an entrepreneur is, how do we do it? I think a lot of problems can be licked. Now, I'm not being, well, I hope I'm not being naive. Man's thinking, bro, you're naive. But I do believe that any problem, there must be a way of producing a solution that, you know, is effective.
No, I think it's what you've done, what you've created there looks amazing. And I have no doubt that it would be a improvement on what's currently being taught. Yeah, so I think there's definitely going to be a way. I think, like I said, my skepticism is grounded in my personal experience.
And believe me, bro, I've seen the same things. I've been in staff rooms where the teachers are talking about the pupils.
Yeah.
And by the amount of hostility, you can tell if they're talking about black people.
Yeah.
Yeah, believe me, I've been there, I've seen it.
And there has to be, I guess, there has to be an appetite. I've found, you know, for any teacher, there has to be an appetite for what they're teaching. And appetite is lacking. So, in many ways, I'm like, your curriculum is perfect. It's got to work well for progressives, because not all teachers are like that. There are a lot of progressive teachers out there.
True.
And it's definitely, and it should work well for even people who are just who are good teachers and just want to teach a good lesson. So yeah, why can't it work? Absolutely. You've won me over somewhat. Definitely, because I'd very much resided myself to the idea that I wasn't interested in integration, and we just have to figure out a way of getting our history and our lessons in front of black children, and that's likely going to be outside of the daily schooling system, but we can still do it. No, that's out. It wasn't. Yes, I guess you're winning me over.
My thing is that we have to approach it both ways. Two strategies. Yeah, and what you said is one of them. But we have to go into the mainstream as well.
I like it.
And I practice what I preach. You know, I am the principal of a Saturday school, so I do practice what I preach.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I like it. It's encouraging. It's encouraging. I think that's one of the takeaways so far of our conversation that I've had. A lot of you give me a lot of encouraging insights. I always like solutions. I think it's great to sit down and just have conversations about history and to talk about all the great things, ancestors from certain lineages achieved. I know it was awesome back then. I think a lot of people do that, and I have nothing against that. But ultimately, I'm a solution person, and I'm always looking at, okay, armed with this knowledge, how does that, how do we build upon that? How do we develop the places that we are in charge of, the places that we have control over? How do we use those, whether or not your influence is that small or it's that big, or you have massive amounts of influence, how are we going to use that influence to improve the situation? Like you said, instilling pride, for instance, improve that situation for our children who are going to be, you know, inheriting this world from us. So I love the fact that everything you do is built around these larger solutions. You're not just kind of creating these kind of.
And the other thing too is we have to respect those that have put the foundation stones. So, for example, the Portland model baseline essays, nobody's giving those pioneers the respect.
Mm.
They deserve the respect. People need to know about the Portland model baseline and then use that as their starting point to update and improve. Do you see?
Mm. No, that's such a good point, because like, how often do we, even you mentioned it, by the way, I'm not going to act like I know, I'd heard of that before you mentioned it. That's the first I've heard of it. And I'm a qualified teacher, I'm in curriculum, and this is something that I'm actively interested in doing, is developing curriculums like yourself doing. I think my appetite's probably more geared towards Africa than, because I see it as I know they're kind of very indoctrinated, but I still see it as a more fertile ground in terms of the ability to change from the ground upwards.
Mm-hmm.
But you've mentioned something there that I'm not aware of, and how often do we enter certain fields and not utilize the groundwork that others have done, starting from scratch all the time? I guess this is one of the things that Eurocentrists do really well. They don't rebuild, you know, every decade. You know, they're just taking, oh well, he's done that, so I'm going to take that, and they're constantly doing that. And I guess, yeah, sometimes we can just make a lot of work for ourselves, not by not knowing these things exist. So even you highlighting that is probably really helpful for people who have these kind of aspirations and ambitions to build schools, build their own curriculums. Robin Walker is saying it right now, you need to be familiar with these Portland essays, which is really insightful. That's very useful. Thank you. I want to, before you go, because we're about 2.5 hours in now, and this has been a very interesting conversation. Do you need to zip off?
No, I can give you half an hour or so.
Oh, awesome. That's good. Because I want to have a conversation about something that's more relevant. If you're willing to talk about it, you did something quite interesting this weekend. I don't know how much can you tell us about what you were doing this weekend, the kind of conversations that you were having, and the kind of input that you gave.
Basically, I was one of the people that participated at the Reparations conference. And this is a conference called by the MP, Belrabiro Adi. And the idea was to bring together the activists and the intellectuals to talk about certain issues to do with reparations. And this is what can be done as restitution for Black people whose ancestors went through mass enslavement. What kind of discourse? And the only thing that I can say that's really kind of relevant to our audience watching is that the discourse has moved from the grassroots. There are MPs that are now talking about it. And there are politicians on the international stage that are a part of it. So I was at the Accra Reparations Conference 2023 that was called by His Excellency, the President of Ghana, Nana Addo Dankwa. He called it, it was his gig. And one of the people that beamed in from satellite feed came in was Her Excellency the ruler of Barbados, Mia Motley. So the reparations discourse has moved from the grassroots to where it's being embraced by people that are either on the inside or partly on the inside.
It's a very interesting conversation, and I'd like to get more of your input on it, because it's multi-layered. And one of the things that I wanted to say to you, but I wanted to save it for us having this conversation live now, was that this discussion of reparations looks different in depending on which diaspora group you're referring to, talking about Africa on the African continent. So I guess the first question I'm going to ask you is, in terms of the British reparations argument, what does that look like at the moment? Because I'd imagine it looks very different to the American one. What is the baseline of the argument that's being put forward, and what is the proposal of what could be offered in terms of reparation from your understanding?
Yeah, different intellectuals have different positions. My own position is informed by the research of Professor Robert Beckford. He did a documentary in 2005 called The Empire Pays Back. And he broke down the argument about reparations. He broke it down into three categories. The first is the issue of unpaid wages. The second is the issue of unjust enrichment. And the third is the issue of false imprisonment. And so essentially, you work out how many enslaved people there were. Had they been employed, they would have paid a wage. Had they been employed, they would have paid for their own board and lodgings. So you need to make that part of your adjustment. And then work out what would be, taking into account board and lodging, what would they have been paid? Multiply that by the amount of enslaved people, and then that gives us a figure for the unpaid wages. Do you see? Then you have the issue of unjust enrichment. People that are engaged in slave trading are engaged in unjust enrichment. And so we could then come with a notional figure for that. And then false imprisonment.
So that would be like a penalty, that second one you've mentioned, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And then the third aspect would be false imprisonment. What happens if someone goes to prison, and what would be the average compensation if it turns out that they were falsely imprisoned? And then apply that to the millions of enslaved people under the rule of the British Empire during mass enslavement. Do you see? And so they came up with particular figures. In 2005, they came with 4 trillion pounds in unpaid wages when you compound it from 1838 till now. 2 million in terms of unjust enrichment, and 1 million in terms of enrichment.
You said 2 million?
Excuse me, 2 trillion and then 1 trillion. So the total they came with was 7 trillion.
Okay, yeah, that's
at 2005 prices. I have to stress that. And that would be the logic of what Britain would have owed to its enslaved people. Now, there's a lot that's not being accounted for, because none of that's got anything to do with colonialism. None of that has got anything to do with the Benin bronzes. Yeah, those are all separate figures requiring a separate total. Do you see? This is just mass enslavement. Now, Professor Beck,
clear. Sorry. So this claim is just for Britain's involvement in slavery in the Caribbean. Is that correct?
Correct. And yeah. All the people under the control of the British Empire up to 1838 that went through slavery. Yeah. Now, the same model could be used for colonialism. Yeah. But I don't think anyone got that far in the discourse that we heard on Saturday. The same model needs to be tracking down the African arts, the African manuscripts, etc., that are in European museums. that stuff needs to be tracked down. And then specific things like, for example, during the colonial period, we know that the same plantation regime was brought to the Congo, where they managed to kill off more than half of the Congolese population over a 15-year period. Yeah, that has to be atoned for, but that's a separate conversation because it's their separate claim. You see, yeah? That's the kind of discourse. Now, I'm getting it from Professor Robert Beckford. Other intellectuals have come with their own formulations. So the Caribbean governments have come with what they call the 10-point plan. Yeah. And that's one that they're advancing. But obviously, whichever way you cut it, it results in a lot of big monetary sums involved.
Yeah. That's really interesting. It's interesting because even the breakdown that you gave me from, you say Dr. Beckford?
Robert Beckford, yeah.
It's similar to, I guess, I've been listening to kind of conversations in and around reparations in the Americas, so not necessarily not in the Caribbean, but it's a similar conversation in that there's several arms that need to be addressed. It's not just kind of like single. People got this idea of reparations for slavery, and it's like, well, it's not just slavery. Slavery is one of the things that's owed. Slavery, like you said, that's owed wages. Okay, that's one thing. That's a remuneration. But then you've also then got the act itself. Are you going to penalize it as an inhumane act and pay out a compensation for that? And that is something that we do have. We do have track record for. It's something that's paid to the Jews regarding the Holocaust as it being an act. It wasn't a case of they're owed wages. They weren't owed any wages, this, that, and the other. But Germany agrees that as an act, it was unjust, and therefore we're going to, make a repairing payment towards you, a reparative payment towards you and the descendants who suffered as a result of this unjust act we committed. But then in the Americas, you've got this much bigger thing that happened. Well, some people call it Jim Crow, but there's kind of like this whole kind of like cluster of abuse that happened since the abolition, the loss of land, the rescinding on promises of, giving land to free slaves, the numerous race riots and deconstructions of various Black societies that popped up in various places that are today cumulatively worth trillions of pounds of real estate that was unjustly stolen from Black people. When you start to add that up, the sum does become insurmountable. And because the sum is so insurmountable, people think it's unjust to pay it. It's kind of, that's the backward logic. It's like, what you've done was so grand, and the theft was so tangible, and the monetary effect of what you did was so large. You're looking at the figure and you're going, we can't afford that. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, who can afford this? Was like, but that is what is owed. And this is the thing about reparations. People kind of go back and forth about whether or not they're for or against it. I'm kind of like, you have to separate reparations from being this thing that, the British taxpayer, why should I have to pay for I didn't do any slavery. It's like, no. All that aside, your government, your crown owes this debt, regardless of how it's paid for. That's neither here nor there. Your crown and your government owe this debt. So it needs to be paid. There's no amount of moralization or whataboutisms that's going to change the fact that you owe this debt. Sorry, you want to come in. I just want to kind of like share.
No. I don't disagree with. I don't disagree with you. And my thing is, I'm prepared to listen to offers. If someone says they can't pay, okay, well, let's cut a deal. But my thing is that even if it doesn't come to reparations, and there's a high chance it might not, that discourse still needs to be made, because the scale of the injustice should become a part of the history teaching. Because if you don't make it a part of the history teaching, we're back to square one, where a Black person's life is not worth the same as anybody else's. And unfortunately, that is the way it's seen. Do you see? And part of moving Black people from dehumanization to rehumanization is, what were those lives worth? What were those lives worth in terms of the unpaid wages, and what those unpaid wages mean? Because the bottom line is, you, me, we are trillions of pounds poorer than we should have been had we not been enslaved. Yeah. And this is what the problem is. You see, a lot of the far right want to point to the poverty in the Black community, the dysfunction in the Black community, blah, 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 all of which could have been solved, had those unpaid wages been paid, had that unjust enrichment be paid. And I think that this is why this needs to be...
Grandparents rioted and stolen the land that they're on, sorry, gone as well.
Yeah. And so consequently, this needs to be a part of the conversation, whether or not it gets paid or not. It's still, because it's part of the rehumanizing process. And one of the things I said at the conference, you could ask me more about it, was it is important how we change the discourse surrounding enslaved people. What was their role in history? Because just as Africa doesn't get the correct respect, because the default position is to dehumanize, not humanize, enslaved people don't get enough respect, because the default position is to dehumanize, not humanize.
Yeah, it's such an important thing. And I think the standardizing of that knowledge, making it something that's common knowledge, is so important, like you've just said. And I think that starts with us being able to put frameworks of understanding around them. Because I think so many of these problems are wrapped up in such convoluted discussions and long conversations. It makes it really hard. And obviously, as you were mentioning, the far right, they love creating obfuscation and confusion where there's simplicity. They love making kind of like these really just like abstract arguments to try to invalidate one that they love to make as, why none of my ancestors were enslavers, so why should, like, that's kind of like moving goalposts. It's kind of like, let's not personalize this. And I think likewise, let's also be able to put what's happened into frameworks and dispensations so people can understand clearly, from this year to this year, this took place. The calculation for this is this. For this year to this year, this took place. And I think just that act of being able to just black and white, just create this kind of very clear methodological framework for the history of enslaved people, first of all, because I also think separating these enslaved groups is important, because they're coming up with this one lump sum for all Black people. I think it's not practical and it's not clear. As a Nigerian, for instance, someone of Nigerian descent, I'm not owed ancestrally any slavery reparation. I'm not owed any of that. I'm not going to be owed any, any race riots or redlining reparations. I'm not going to be owed any of that. However, we could put a monetary figure over the stuff that we talked about earlier, such as the deconstruction of the Palace of the Oba and the artifacts that have been taken. and the subsequent loss of our internalized manufacturing and leadership structures and stuff like that, a figure could be put on that. But like you said earlier, that's very separate to the discussion that's maybe being had in the Caribbean and the discussion that's maybe being had in the Americas. So I don't know, yeah, if you had any thoughts, but it seems like there's a lot of kind of like clarification and categorizing that.
Yes, and this is why this needs to be done, because again, part of the rehumanizing discourse is there are people online allied to the alt-right that claim that Africa's contributed nothing to world history and so on and so forth. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, what happens is while we can laugh at it, there are people believing that. And one of the things that we need to make clear is colonization and mass enslavement were wealth transfers, were asset transfers. And those transfers, you can't do that to us and then say we were of no value. You see? And that's the key to why I'm about this particular position. You can't do that and then say we're of no value. Mm. Right, the next thing I want to say is taking my umpteenth opportunity to big up the research of Professor Vincent Taraku Farrar. His book, Pre-Colonial African Material Culture, where he writes a technological history of Africa, not including Kemet, not including Carthage, not including the Swahilis. So in other words, he's taken all the civilizations that no one talks about and shows that that technological heritage is still a great heritage. That the point of mass enslavement was to capture that technological heritage and bring it to North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. So, cotton technologies. Did you know there was a British government select committee report in the mid-18th century that says that the cotton that has been found in Senegal has repeatedly been proven to be the finest in the world? Now, why is that important? What do you think slave traders are going to do with that information? Capture the people in Senegal, put them in slavery, and get them to bring cotton technologies to the Western world. You see? And so when it comes to the worth of enslaved
innovation, sorry, carry on. And then claim innovation, I said, after they've stolen the people, then they'll say, we innovated this, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and so when it comes to agricultural technologies, when it comes to, for example, the bringing of African and Asian rice to the Americas, that was done by enslaved people. When it comes to mining, mining, the first mines were in Eswatini or Swaziland 43,000 years ago. You know that already, right?
No.
Okay, so that mining technology, Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan dropped that knowledge back in the day. Enslaved Africans were captured to do the silver mines in the Americas. Then you have, obviously, cotton technology we've mentioned, carpentry, boat building. These were very, very important in the Americas. Metallurgy, the very first metallurgists from the Western world that ended up in the Americas were Africans that were enslaved and accompanied the Spanish into Central America. And those enslaved Africans were the metallurgists of the Spanish, you see.
Wow.
So when it comes to that type of history, I think you heard the story about the 76 Jamaican metallurgists who are responsible for the Henry Court method of turning scrap metal into good quality metal. one of the Industrial Revolution techniques. You know that story already, right?
No, I'm going to be totally honest with you. No, I don't. So.
Okay, the reason why I thought you might know it is because the academic who said it, Dr. Jenny Bulstrode, wrote a paper that ended up being picked up by The Guardian about this, and it blew up a couple of years ago. And then the Telegraph newspaper launched a counter-offensive to get Jenny Bulstrode disciplined for having said that. They tried to find holes in the paper, and where the story is at now is on the University of London's website. They've come forward to say, we back Jenny Bulstrode. We're backing her paper. And why am I saying this? Because can you see now that your respect for those enslaved Africans is now shot up? Mm. If I was to tell this to Nigel Farage, his respect for those enslaved Africans would have shot up. That's the point.
Mm. You know what's interesting, because it raises an entirely different discussion around the fact that enslavement, because this is something that's actually I did pick up on quite a lot. Whereas we got this idea, and I'm not saying it's incorrect, but what this idea of kind of just like mass enslavement, grab who you can. But so frequently I've had conversations with, and this might have been the case of those who ended up in North America, by the way. So I'm not going to argue that couldn't have been the case, that this has tainted the data somewhat. But I've frequently had discussions with Black Americans who have done their genealogy. And when it comes to their African relatives, tends to be someone of nobility, which I find fascinating. So it wasn't this case of just like random, and I think you're picking up on that as well. It wasn't this case of just like random grab who you can. We're transferring skilled people. We're transferring people who can start and sustain industries, which we can then pick up and learn their techniques. We're transferring members of royalty. It's a very different picture of slavery than the one that kind of like is just this, you know, everyone is kind of grab them all and grabbing 500 and just shoving them on the, it feels like there's a selection process almost to take the people who are going to, and it makes sense if slavery was a trade where you're trying to make profit. It makes sense that as a slave trader, you're bringing people who can fulfill certain quotas and do certain things that other people can't do, as opposed to just picking up vagabonds, you know, and, you know, people who aren't, you know, doing anything. I don't know. It's just a completely different picture, isn't it, to the one that we. That's
the point. And this is what my kind of mission is when it comes to teaching Black history. This is why I do what I do, because the whole mission is to rehumanize. And rehumanize, bring our history and culture to the same level as everybody else in the public consciousness. Yeah? So that when we're having conversations about any area of science and technology, there's going to be contributions what the Native Americans put to the game. There's going to be contributions what the Chinese put to the game. But there's going to be contributions of what we put to the game. And we need to be a part of those discussions, because that's the way the people who are not of African heritage come to respect the people who are of African heritage. Yeah? All right, so let me give you a for instance. My colleague, Emmanuel Adama, sent me an essay. And let me quote the essay. Right? Let's see if I can find this thing. Okay, the essay is called Nomons at Meroe and Early Trigonometry. And this appeared in 1998, the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, pages 171 to 180. Trigonometry at Meroe. You heard of this, fam?
Yeah.
Do you see? Now, can you see now how this type of information, you now have to put respect on people's names? Yeah. And so that's what I'm engaged in. That's the whole point of why I do what I do when it comes to our history and heritage.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Walker, we've hit, I think, over the 3-hour mark now, and I'm being a bit mindful of how long I've kept you on this call. So I think that would probably be a really good point for us to wrap up this conversation. We could have talked, I guarantee you I could have gone on for another 3 hours. But I'm sure you've got things to do. That was really amazing conversation. Very insightful. Did you enjoy yourself?
It was a pleasure to do. It was a blast.
Yeah, I've had honestly, I've had a great time. I think you didn't disappoint. I always knew it was going to be a good conversation. I had no idea where this was going to go, but I've had a really, really enjoyable discussion. I tell you, like, I've literally touched on probably like 5% of where this, in terms of topics and stuff, where this conversation could have gone. So your wealth of knowledge and the hard work and the input and the years of studying, writing, development of our Black/African history landscape is really, really much appreciated and well received. And I think, like you said earlier, in terms of, like, you're building on the backs of scholars. I'm building on the back of scholars like yourself. So you are a generation who has a generation behind you who are continuing this kind of legacy of making sure that our history is not only remembered, it's celebrated. So thank you so much for what you do.
Respect. It was a pleasure. Hope the audience listening, hope you got something out of it. And the other thing too is, if you want more information, check out my website. My website is called The Black Secret. We have an online course. Check us out.
Is it theblacksecret.com?
.co.uk. Theblacksecret.co.uk.
So
we have an education program, 80 hours of content teaching Black history, and yeah, check us out.
Please do. It's an amazing network. I'm good friends with Brother George, and it's, like I said, it's a pleasure to have been introduced to yourself. Mr. Walker, thank you for your time. It's been an amazing conversation, and I look forward to this going live. Yeah, on that note, have a fantastic day, and hopefully I'll talk to you not too long.
Well, listen, have a good one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.